Along the centuries-old Roman road that stretches from Albert-Bapaume, we follow a pathway across the landscape of the Great War and the battlefields of the Somme. Here we might pause and ask, is there a culture of the old front line, and what does it mean? We often speak about pathways on this podcast, the routes by which we visit, access or traverse the landscape of the old front line. Some of these are imaginary pathways, following long-gone trench lines or linking the line of battlefield cemeteries to show the space where battle once was. But others are actual physical pathways, roads, and these roads which cut the landscape of, for example, the Western Front, are a very good example of this. Many of these roads we use today to access those battlefields, but more than a century ago, they were not just the site of fighting, but often gave their name to that fighting as well. The Battle of the Menin Road Ridge in September 1917 in Flanders is a good example of that. Other roads delineate a battlefield, divide it geographically, regionally, or in terms of units that fought there, as during the Great War, roads and tracks were often used as battlefield boundaries, delineating where attacks were made. And all of this interests me. It's very much part of the layers of the landscape that we frequently talk about here, and I think it's part of the culture of the old front line, something I've occasionally spoken about here. So what is that culture? What does that mean? Well, for me it's something I don't actually have a definitive answer to, and certainly not all the answers. It's an idea that's grown in my mind since beginning this podcast in 2020, when I sat down and formulated the ideas and began to talk about the battlefields of the Great War, discussing that war, that conflict, in a different way by transferring what I knew, what I'd researched, what I'd seen, and often what I'd experienced, and in some cases lived through, into something that might be understandable, comprehensible, and of interest to a wider audience. And it changed my perspective of these battlefields forever, really. So the discussion about this culture is something I would very much like to take forward with the podcast, and I've started discussing it with friends who are very much on the wavelength of the Great War, and indeed that wavelength, as my old friend John Dray called it, and others like John Giles and Rose Coombs and Lynn MacDonald used that and other words to describe what that wavelength was, that connection, and that is all part of this culture of the battlefields. I want to take that further, develop it, see what it means, what it might mean, and I welcome your input to that as well. But taking all this into account and putting it into something practical rather than just talking round it, what I aim to do with the podcast is a few episodes over the next year or so about these pathways, which are very much part of how we explore that landscape and find our way, find our feet, treading through that culture and the wider aspects, the layers of First World War history on that landscape. And we'll start this exploration of these pathways with an obvious one, the Albert-Bapaume Road on the Somme. This road, which cuts through the 1916 Somme battlefields, is not just closely associated with the battle itself, but is very much part of it. On a rolling chalk downland, it cuts across that landscape, hones it, takes our eye to a vanishing point in it very often, and defines it in so many ways. But what is it? What is the Albert-Bapaume Road? Well, when we look at a wider map of that area of northern France, where Britain and its empire, its Commonwealth is today, was fighting those great battles more than a century ago, we see a landscape crisscrossed by dead straight roads, what we would call Roman roads, because that's exactly what they are. This whole area of France was very much part of the Roman world, and the shadows of that culture, of that past, the layers of that history are very much part of the landscape of the First World War. And the Albert-Bapaume Road was part of the route from Paris, from central France, up towards the coast, which Roman legions would have marched along, heading up towards the coast to first conquer Britain on the other side of the Channel, and then continue to occupy it. So their men, their supplies, and lots of other things besides would have gone up roads, dead straight roads like this. And the Albert-Bapaume Road meets up with other road systems that do the same. One that goes from Bapaume to Arras, for example, or Bapaume down towards Péronne, or Bapaume to Cambrai. So there are a whole load of these different road networks, and they are all in themselves pathways through this landscape of the First World War and through the culture of the old front line. So where was the Albert-Bapaume Road on the eve of the battle in 1916? It cut right through the middle of where both sides' positions were. It started in Albert to the west, behind the British lines, cut through their forward trenches, overlooking the villages of La Boisselle and Ovillers, and two significant valleys that we'll talk about in our journey along this pathway, and then continued through a whole number of villages that were behind the German lines, part of their infrastructure, which had been formed following those early battles on the Somme in 1914, and the establishment of the trench system and everything that was behind it on both sides. On the British side, they were positions inherited from the French, who'd been there first, developed by the British, but the Germans, they'd been there since September of 1914 and had built up a mighty infrastructure that carried their troops to and from Bapaume. And Bapaume, just as Albert was to British and before that French soldiers, was a significant town because it was the site of a railhead. There was a major railhead on the outskirts of Bapaume where German units could be brought in from other parts of the front along with supplies and ammunition and everything else, and they could then be moved to other parts of the front from there too. Leave trains could take them home to Germany from that point. So really, those two towns at the end, either end of this Roman road, very much signified the respective forces' soldiers' experience of the Great War. One was behind the Tommy's trenches, and the other was behind Fritz's front line. And they were very much part of the wartime culture of these areas, as no doubt we will discuss. And as the battle began after the 1st of July 1916, the first day on the Battle of the Somme, and would continue along that road right up to the end of the campaign in November of 1916, the fighting would unravel around the road itself, often take place on the road. The road would be very much part of it, and the villages along the road would be really the beacons to the history, the wider history of both sides' experience as the Somme moved from a summer's day in July through to mud and rain and eventually snow by November of 1916. But let's now follow that pathway, think about the culture of the old front line and follow that ground from Albert to Bapaume. If we begin our journey along the Albert-Bapaume Road, we've got to start from a British and Commonwealth, and before that a French perspective in the town of Albert. Albert to the British soldier, or Bert, sat just behind the British positions in the central part of what became the 1916 front on the Somme, where British and Commonwealth forces fought, and it became a main arterial route for troops to come up to, and a town which so many units passed through on their way to the front line and to the battles that took place here. It had, and we're standing now right in the centre of the modern Albert, a town completely destroyed by the end of the war in 1918, very much part of the post-war Zone Rouge, the Red Zone, and you'll remember to qualify to be part of that Red Zone, you had to be a community that suffered a minimum of 80% destruction, and Albert pretty much fitted the bill for that. Central to the town was the Basilica, and we're standing in front of that now. And around us are 1920s, many of them with kind of Art Deco features, which is very common in this region. A lot of Art Deco architecture that was used in the rebuilding phase of towns like Albert on the Somme, or further to the north in the Pas-de-Calais, and in other parts of France as well. But the Basilica, the church here, was something that sat on a holy spot that had been the scene of pilgrimage for many, many centuries. And the Basilica was built as we know it from a Great War perspective in 1912 and finished that year. So only 2 years before the Great War. It was a cathedral-like building with a tall tower on top of which was a golden figure of Mary with her outstretched arms holding the infant Jesus. And initially, French troops were here in the fields outside Albert fighting the Germans in September 1914 as both sides began to position themselves following the German failure on the Marne, the end of the Schlieffen Plan, and the movement of troops in northern France, which would lead to the so-called race to the sea. And French troops passed through here. The front was then established on the outskirts of Albert, trenches were dug, and during that first winter of 1914-15, the civilian population was still living here. Shells dropped on the town, some civilians were killed, some buildings were damaged, and then in January 1915, the Basilica got hit by a shell, and that figure of Mary toppled over at a roughly kind of 90-degree angle, and it was wired up by French engineers to stop it falling into the square below, and that was when a legend grew that when the Virgin fell, the war would end. So if that figure of Mary toppled, that would be a signal that the end of the war was either then or very close. And it was brought down in 1918, not by German shells, but after Albert had been captured in March 1918 during the German offensive, and British gunners dropped heavy artillery onto it because they knew the tower would be used by German observers just in the way that British observers had used it in the 1916 battles. But the symbol of the Basilica, the Leaning Virgin, the Golden Virgin, it had so many names. When the Australians came here in the summer of 1916, they called it Fanny Durack, because Fanny Durack was an Australian female Olympic swimmer who'd won a gold medal at the 1912 Olympics, and they reckon it looked like Fanny Durack diving into an Olympic swimming pool. So the Aussies called it Fanny Durack. Whatever name it had, it was a symbol for the men who were there, and they bought in their thousands, probably tens of thousands, postcards showing the Basilica before the war, during the war with the figure of Mary toppled over, and then postcards showing close-ups of baby Jesus in Mary's hands. And these postcards and many others like them were sent home by the troops on the eve of the battle during the fighting of 1916 and became some of the standard images of this part of the Somme. And for many of the men who served here in the approach to the battle in 1916, it was a landmark that they could see from their trenches. Later on, even once the fighting began, when men marched up the Albert-Bapaume Road, they could look back and see it, or see it as they were coming towards Albert, knowing that there were the villages where they were going to have some rest. So, and I think when you read some of the German accounts, that they also talk about seeing it in the distance, and it was a symbol to them as well. And while you don't see it so much on their photographs and postcards, it's just that little bit too far away, nevertheless, it is something that they couldn't fail but to notice, because there it was. So this whole symbol of this building, on what it stood for, and the men who marched in its shadow going to and from the front, it was very much part of the defining experience and very much part of the wartime culture of towns like Albert. And before the battle began, when there were more civilians still living here. That when the British arrived on the Somme in the summer of 1915 and took over Albert, the civilian population was still here. As you got nearer and nearer to the Battle of the Somme, more and more of these civilians were moved out. I don't think many were still living there when the battle began on the 1st of July 1916. But some years ago I bought a little collection of photographs of men from the 17th Battalion Northumberland Fusiliers, the North Eastern Railway Battalion, and they were based in Albert for quite some time in the lead-up to the Battle of the Somme, and they went to one of several photographers in the town and had their photos taken with their limbers and equipment and some of their men. And in the background of many of these group photographs, there it is, the Leaning Virgin, the Basilica, the tower with the Mary on top at a 90-degree angle. And I think that was not an accident, it was deliberate. That was part of their culture on that battlefield, and they wanted images with them on it and with that in the background. So it was a very powerful symbol. And I think things like this, as we're discussing what this culture means and how it develops, that's very much part of it. So when we leave the Basilica, and if you want to know more about Albert, and indeed many of these places that we will visit on this journey along the Albert-Bapaume Road, you can go back through the podcast catalogue to find separate episodes, and there is one on Albert itself. But we'll leave the Basilica in the modern Albert, which, like so many places on that landscape of the First World War, rose like a phoenix from the ashes of destruction, and we'll take a road as we walk away or drive away, whichever means by which you're travelling across this landscape today. We're going to go up Rue de Birmingham, named after Birmingham in Britain, because Birmingham twinned with Albert after the First World War and helped it with the reconstruction. Many towns and villages and cities in Britain did this to help the cities and towns and villages of France that had been destroyed in the bombardments of the Great War. And while not many of those twinnings still survive today, some do, Birmingham is no longer twinned with Albert. I think it's Ulverston that's twinned with Albert these days. Nevertheless, this street, Rue de Birmingham, marking that twinning, is still very much here. And that in itself is part of the history of this landscape, one of the layers, because it really connects us directly to that post-war period, the reconstruction and the rebuilding of these shattered landscapes across northern France. And it will take us out of the town onto the very straight beginnings of this Roman road. Albert is a functional town. Having lived very near to it for so many years, I can say that with a degree of fondness. It was a functional town, and it still is. We're not going to see any particularly nice buildings as we walk along this road, but it will take us out of the town up to a very large roundabout on the outskirts now, and then up towards rising ground beyond that. Now, on my very first visit to the Somme, I walked up here with my dad in 1982, in the summer of 1982, and as we approached this, and bearing in mind, this is pre-internet, a lot of guidebooks. The only guidebook I had with me was Rose Coombs' Before Endeavours Fade. We could see on the rise ahead of us a military cemetery. That's kind of what we were heading towards. And that is Bapaume Post Cemetery, dwarfed a little bit by some of the industrial buildings there now and the Ibis Hotel, but it's still there. A small battlefield cemetery, and it is a battlefield cemetery, located on the reverse slope of this ridge that's ahead of us. And we can begin to see the texture of the Somme as we come out of Albert onto the beginning of this rolling chalk downland now. It sits there on the reverse slope, so it was safe to bury the dead, and it is a site where men were brought back to for burial, and when men were killed in the opening stage of the first day of the Somme going over this ridge towards the next villages, they were brought here for burial too. So it covers quite a broad period, a lot of stories and some fascinating individuals buried in here, including Captain Scott, Harry Scott of the Canadians, who was the son of Canon Frederick Scott, a Canadian chaplain who went up onto the battlefield at Courcelette and recovered his body there in the wasteland of shell holes and brought it back here for burial. There are some very moving photographs of Canon Scott taken at this cemetery when it was wooden crosses. He buried his son here. He went off to take part in many other battles after that, and then, of course, discovered that the Germans had overrun Albert in March 1918, and he was concerned that the grave and the cemetery might have been destroyed in the fighting, or possibly even deliberately destroyed by the Germans. And so as soon as Albert was liberated in the summer of 1918, he came here and he visited the cemetery and was pleased to see that it was still intact, and he stood there at his son's grave, a white cross, and he was photographed alongside it. And there it is, a father standing by a son's grave, and the father, not just a casual bypasser who's come on a pilgrimage, but a man himself who'd experienced some of the great battles of the First World War. And I think as part of our experience as we navigate these pathways through this landscape, and we're aware of the literature and what connects us to the cemeteries, which are themselves beacons to the history of the Great War, we know, we can discover, we can read, we can research stories like Canon Scott's and his son, Captain Scott, who fell at Courcelette. And that is part of the culture, because every time I pass this, I cast an eye, whether I'm driving up here, walking, passing in a coach, my eye moves to that part of the cemetery where I know Captain Scott's headstone is, and I think of that photograph of the Padre standing there in silence with a kind of half grin on his face, pleased, delighted, thankful to his God that he's returned here, survived to return here, and that his son's grave is still intact. And as we pass those lads in the Bapaume Post, we come up onto the crest of that ridge, and this is part of a position that's marked on the wartime maps as the Tara Usna line. These were typical of the kind of names that was given to this landscape. There was a Tara redoubt close by and a Tara hill. Tara is in Wexford, and it is a hill in Wexford. Usna is less clear to me as to what that is, and if anyone's got any additional information on that, again, as always, we learn every day. But the names given by troops to these locations was a way of referencing home, connecting themselves to home, and also identifying the landscape so that they could pinpoint themselves in it from their own perspective, but more importantly from a military perspective, so you could report on where you were, where the enemy was, and where the fighting was at its fiercest, for example. And coming up onto the crest of this Tara Usna hill and looking on a clear day, we can see for miles from here, down into the valleys beneath us, where there are two villages clearly nestling. Come to those shortly, but beyond that the road dips and rises again to a high point. We can see a village in the distance, and then beyond that a higher point again. And for many years on the modern landscape there was a radio mast in that particular location at the Pozieres windmill site, which we will come to shortly, and that was a good marker. That's been dismantled now, so that physical marker on the modern landscape that so many of us got used to, that has gone. So the culture, the landscape changes, and with it our understanding and how we react to that landscape, that changes too. But what we get a sense of, I think, just starting up here, is the nature of this ground. I often read accounts online, social media, from people discussing the Somme battlefields, particularly if they've never been there. They often reference it as flat as a billiard table. When you come here, you can see that that isn't the case. This is a chalk landscape. It's a rolling landscape. Sure, there are no ridges like we'd find in Scotland or Ireland or Wales or many other parts of Britain and its wider empire, but there's enough of a movement of terrain, of dips and folds and rising ground, to affect how positions were placed here during the First World War, where trenches were dug and where trenches were not dug, with good fields of fire, for example, or positions where they wouldn't easily get flooded in this landscape. All of that was a consideration. And what we see is how landscape really dictates the landscape, the layout of a battlefield, and also eventually in the changing use and importance of that landscape, where the geology and the geography dictate where things were built so that the fighting could take place. When that fighting was over and this landscape becomes a place of sacrifice, we see that then reflected in the placement of cemeteries and memorials and battlefield beacons, whether that is a museum or a visitor centre or an area of preserved battlefield. And just across to our right from here, we can see the rough ground of the Lochnagar mine crater, for example, preserved by Richard Dunning in the 1970s, and today one of the most impressive sites on the Somme to visit to get a sense of the scale of the underground war on the Western Front during the Great War. So stopping and pausing like this on this landscape and surveying it with our eye and seeing and understanding where positions were more than a century ago and joining that up and looking, thinking, yeah, I get why they built a set of trenches there, and I get why an advance took place there, because the geography kind of hones you into those positions, kind of forces you almost in some cases to fight your battles in that place, whether you like it or not. And I think that having vantage points like this, where you can pause and understand this landscape, this texture of the Somme, is really, really important as looking at memorials and paying your respects in cemeteries, because none of that really makes sense unless you understand the wider landscape in which those memorials and cemeteries exist. So continuing downhill, we drop down into the beginning of two valleys. Over to our right, the long valley that stretches beyond the village of La Boisselle in front of us to the next village of Contalmaison. And in the lead up to the Battle of the Somme, at that far end of that valley towards Contalmaison was a German observation unit with observation balloons, which were big sausage-shaped balloons that kept popping up, and that became known as Sausage Valley. And then if you have a Sausage Valley, you've got to have a Mash Valley as well, and the valley we can see to the left of the Albert-Bapaume Road, heading towards the next village of Ovier-la-Boisselle, Overlers, that is Mash Valley. And that was one of the longest distances across no man's land where British soldiers attacked on the first day of the Somme. And we can see on the rising ground to the left of that valley, Ovier Military Cemetery, where many of the dead from the early phase of the advance here are buried. But before we get into the village of La Boisselle ahead of us, there is a little memorial on a road junction here. It's a triangular bit of ground just to the right of the Albert-Bapaume Road, and that was the site of the pre-1914 civil cemetery of La Boisselle. The trenches cut right through, rather macabrely cut through that little bit of ground, right through those burials. But today, on the kind of point of that triangle, there is a memorial to the Tyneside Scottish and the Tyneside Irish, which were 8 battalions of the Northumberland Fusiliers, themselves part of the 34th Division, that attacked across this ground towards La Boisselle, towards the Lochnagar crater, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And these were 2 proud, locally raised units of Kitchener's army, drawn from the Tyneside community, 4 of them, over 4,000 men from the Scottish community in Tyneside, so they were the Tyneside Scottish, and over 4,000 from the Irish community in Tyneside, and they were the Tyneside Irish. And this memorial seat has got the badges of both those units and text on it recording who it commemorates. Now, this again is all part of the culture of the old front line. This is a memorial built by the survivors to remember their sacrifice, their service, and more greatly, the sacrifice of their comrades who fell in such great numbers here at the beginning of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. They were proud units, proud of their heritage, proud of their own pre-war culture of what they stood for, and for them, remembering the fallen, remembering the dead, remembering sacrifice was all part of who they were. The nickname of the Tyneside Scottish was as hard as hammers, but these were hard men, and I met one of them in the 80s, Tom Easton, who was a veteran of the Tyneside Scottish. They were tough guys, they were really tough individuals, but they had come to understand, even before the war, the meaning of service, the meaning of relying on the man next to you, the meaning of relying on your wider community. So when that community was so greatly affected by something like the First World War, they were moved to build a monument like this so that sacrifice would never be forgotten. And that in itself, that reaction to loss, that reaction to sacrifice, and how veterans saw themselves and saw their wider war experience, I think is very much part of what we find on the landscape today, and very much part of this wider culture of the old front line. And as we travel through La Boisselle, and we can see Overlook Cemetery across the rooftops from where we are, there's some modern build houses on the left-hand side. And this is a bit of changing landscape here, because if you'd have come to La Boisselle in the interwar period, this is where you'd have stopped, because there was a bit of rough ground with a fence round it and a gate and a signboard indicating that you were at La Grande Mine, the big mine crater. It wasn't Lochnagar in those days. That was down a little side track that was difficult to get to. Most battlefield pilgrims came to the crater that was once here, the Wysap crater, the twin crater to Lochnagar that was blown in the attack here on the 1st of July. It was a massive crater that existed up until the 1970s, when so few people were coming here. The farmer thought that Britain, the Empire, and everyone else had forgotten the Great War, and he filled it in. And it sat filled in for many, many years. You could see this white scar in this field when I first came here in the 1980s. And then sometime in the late 90s, around about 2000, this site was developed and these houses were built. What kind of foundations they must have in a landscape that was smashed to bits, not just by artillery fire, but the explosion of tons of ammonol on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, I don't know. But what it shows us is how the landscape can change and evolve, and some of the visible scars of the war, the visible reminders of the war, can disappear. So one of the layers we have sometimes is trying to reconstruct that with the landscape as it is today by literally kind of overlaying images from the past, whether that's air photos from the war showing the crater, or pictures taken by some of the battlefield pioneers, as I call them, people like John Giles, who photographed this landscape and this crater in the 1960s and 70s. So it's a changing landscape there. And as we come out of La Boisselle, the ground is now rising again. We've come through the valleys. We've got Mash Valley and Sausage Valley still to our right. We've come out through the village, and ahead of us is an even bigger ridge line from the one we crossed on the Tara-Usna line, the hill behind us. This is the Pozières Ridge. And as we approach Pozières, we come alongside the large Pozières British Cemetery and Memorial. The cemetery dating from 1916, with roughly half Canadian and Australians from the fighting at Pozières and Courcelette. A lot of British units that fought there as well. 48th South Midland Division was in action here. Charles Carrington, who wrote the Subalterns' War. If you look down to your left, there's a little metal hangar out in the fields there, which was an agricultural hangar for many years. I think it was a showroom fairly recently. Just beyond that is where Charles Carrington's men of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment were in July 1916, as the British moved forward from Mash Valley and Overlook up towards the next village of Pozières. The Australians then took over, captured Pozières in a single night in July 1916, but then spent 2 months fighting for the ground around it. Over to the left, farm complex known as Mouquet Farm, something we've spoken about many times on this podcast, and then beyond the village itself on the highest point, which we're walking towards, was the Pozières windmill and 2 German trench lines known as OG1 and OG2, Old German Line 1 and Old German Line 2. But the walls of the cemetery here became a memorial when memorials to the missing, those who disappeared on this landscape, were then built. The French kind of got fed up with them at one point in many ways and passed a bylaw saying that they could only now be built where there was an existing cemetery. And this memorial, which largely commemorates men who died in March and April of 1918, should have been elsewhere, possibly near Saint-Quentin and Quentin. But there was no cemetery there that was big enough for it, and it ended up being built as a wall around this cemetery. So the memorial commemorates over 14,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who died on the Somme from the 21st of March through to August of 1918, when the Vis-en-Artois Memorial then takes over for the last 100 days of the First World War. While most of the men on the panels here died in March, particularly on the 21st of March 1918. It does commemorate quite a wide array of actions, not just in this central Somme area, but south of the Somme, places like Villers-Bretonneux, for example, and close to Le Hamel, and in the advances across that central part of the Somme Valley by the Germans and British units stopping that. But it is a defining memorial of the First World War when we visit it. It's very easy, casual almost, to drive down this road and stop here and see this mighty cemetery with its walls and its pillars, its Portland stone pillars on the main front face of the cemetery site, which forms part of the central element of the memorial. When we go in, we see these long lists of names, and I think that's where we begin to really understand the scale of the First World War, another element of its culture. It's not an individualist war. There are lots of individual stories, but the scale of loss, the scale of men that were here is something that often it's difficult to grasp. But I think memorials like this give us a bit of insight into that. And if we go right back to the beginnings of the culture of this podcast, this is where we began the Old Front Line nearly 5 years ago in March 2020 with our first walk, our first battlefield walk, as we walked around the area of Pozières. And I chose that because it's been a really important part in my journey across this landscape. My old friend Yves Foucault was the gardener here for many years. And when I first got to know him, this is where he worked, and I often popped in to see him. And when I moved to the Somme, he lived in Pozières, and he and his wife Christiane, they often call them my French grandparents, and that's kind of what they were to me. And as I walk away, as we walk or drive away from this now on our journey along this pathway, and we come into the village of Pozières, we can see to our left the memorial to the 1st Australian Division and the site of the Gibraltar bunker. We'll come to that in a minute. But on our right, we first pass the King's Royal Rifle Corps Memorial, which is it's easy just to kind of pass by. It's tucked away behind some modern houses, commemorating the role of King's Royal Rifle Corps battalions, of which there were many on the Somme in 1916. But there's a bit of ground just in front of that, and that is where I last saw Yves, just before he died in 1997. He was a battlefield walker. He walked those battlefield landscapes and had an incredible eye for the artefacts that were there. And the ground had just been ploughed that week, and he was there because he knew the landowner, who was a friend of his. They'd been friends for many years, and he had permission to walk across that field and pick up stuff. He wasn't looking for munitions or things like that. It was the smaller items. And I remember seeing him in that field, bending over and wondering what it was he was picking up. And sadly, that was the last time I saw him. So as part of this culture of the First World War, we all have experiences like this. We've all come here, we've met people, we've got to know people, we've travelled here with friends, and our stories and how we've reacted to this landscape and the people within it are all part of that culture, I think. And coming into Pozières, we go past that memorial site where the Australian 1st Division monument is. The Gibraltar bunker that was once there was a massive German concrete structure. It was named not because of Hanoverian units that had the battle honour on their cuff of Gibraltar, but because it looked like the Rock of Gibraltar, this massive structure that looked and was like the shape of the Rock of Gibraltar. That was part of the Australian experience when they came into the village. It was a bunker used by the Germans, not so much as a machine gun position, but as an observation post and a headquarters. The cellars of it that were built on top of an existing structure are still there. The top section of the bunker was destroyed in the 1920s, although there is some evidence the Australians were going to build a memorial park here. So it kind of gives us an insight into the symbolism of sites like this, because this was once deemed so important that it was going to become part of a permanent site in which the Australian, the digger sacrifice on the Somme would be marked for all time. That didn't quite happen, but there is the 1st Australian Division Memorial just beyond it. Pozières is like so many of the villages on the Somme, shattered, reduced to dust in 1916, let alone the fighting that happened 2 years later, but again that rose from the ashes of destruction and was rebuilt. And again, a functional village rather than necessarily an attractive one, but much frequented now by battlefield visitors because of the Latomy bar on the right-hand side, run by Dominic Zanardi, one of the great characters of the Somme in recent years, very much part of the culture of the Somme today, a man who has an absolutely unprecedented collection of Great War material, much of which he's found himself on the battlefields over the years, but a man with honour, who I greatly respect, who has recovered the dead on many occasions and made sure that they were properly commemorated and handed over to the right authorities so they could be buried properly in a respective cemetery depending on their nationality. Dominic deserves a podcast of his own and certainly a YouTube film of his own, and I'm sure that's something that I will return to in the near future. But as we come out of the other side of Pozières, on approaching the crest of the ridge, we see a memorial site ahead of us. We can see a column to the right, which is the tank memorial, where there's a white column with 4 bronze models of First World War tanks, and kind of a fence around it, which when we look closer is the chain that pushed the tracks around the rhombus shape of the tank. That links a whole series of 6-pounder gun barrels together that form the fence round the memorial. And the tanks that are on there are 2 Mark IV male tanks with 6-pounder guns. There were male and female tanks with heavy firepower, 6-pounders, female tanks with machine guns. There's a Whippet tank, a reconnaissance tank from 1918 on there, and an artillery tractor as well. And the Whippet has a bullet stuck in it, in fact, from the Second World War, when this area was strafed, when this road, this pathway that we're on now, became important once more in not fighting, but in reinforcing the German army in Normandy. And columns of vehicles were going down this road and being strafed by the United States Army Air Force to stop them from getting to Normandy. And a bullet struck the memorial and is stuck there forevermore. It was recently renovated, the memorial, and I'm pleased to say that the bullet was not removed as part of those renovations. On the other side of the road is the site of the Pozières windmill, a big tall tower, stone tower, and we're on a high point here. And if you walk to the back of the site now, the tower was never rebuilt. We can see this kind of mound of earth with bits of concrete sticking out, where bits of the German defences, when they concreted the Pozières windmill site, they still remain. There's a pathway from the road. There used to be a wooden gate here with the Australian Rising Sun badge carved in it. That disappeared sometime in the 1990s. Sad, really, because it was a beautiful piece of construction, really, with a beautiful wooden oak gate with the Rising Sun badge, which you kind of pushed open slowly, and it creaked in the morning sunshine, and you walked into what was then quite an overgrown bit of battlefield site up onto this mound. And when we stand on it now, we can see a more recent memorial site close by, remembering the missing of Australia in this fighting here at Pozières from July to September of 1916, and a more recent memorial to the animals who served in the Great War, lost in the Great War, and that has caused quite a lot of controversy in recent years, but it's there. We can't do anything about that. But what we get from here is not what we see, what's been placed here more recently, but it's the view that we get from this location. We're on the highest point of the 1916 Somme battlefield. We're on a mound on that highest point, and if we look to the north, we follow the lines of the pylons, it'll take us straight up to the water tower right by Gommecourt Wood and Gommecourt village, the northern part of the Somme battlefields. So we can see the whole line from there, from Gommecourt across to Serres, across to the Redan Ridge and Hawthorne Ridge and Beaumont-Hamel, and then towards Chapval. We can see the Chapval Memorial very, very clearly from here. We can see Ferme de Mouquet Farm, which was so difficult for the Australians to capture and cost such high casualties, both to the Australians and then the Canadians and the British who fought there in 1916. And we can see the whole of this northern area. But if we turn round, we can look across the southern sector of the Somme as well, right down towards Montauban, the most southern village where British soldiers attacked on the first day of the Somme. So this is one of those places where we can literally see the top and tail, the north and the south of the Somme battlefields of 1916, and so much history and so much sacrifice and so many stories in between those two landmarks. And we can get a true appreciation of the ground here, how the ground develops to the north, how the undulations affect the ridges that are there, the Thiepval Ridge, the Redan Ridge, the Hawthorne Ridge, the high ground at Serre. We can see all of that. And if we look to the east and the northeast, we look at the next phase of the battlefield, where following the capture of this ground in July to September of 1916, the fighting continued. The Empire, the British Empire, so important to the whole Great War in terms of the men and power and munitions and war material that it supplied. This is where its story was cast in so many ways, with the Australians first, the Canadians then took over, and from where we're standing, very close to where we're standing now, the Canadian Corps, its first attack of the Great War, made its assault on the village of Courcelette on the 15th of September 1916. And we're looking straight down into the outskirts of the village of Courcelette, with beyond that the rising ground up to Regina or Regina Trench, the longest German trench on the Western Front, which is where the Canadians was their anvil of sacrifice from September to October and November of 1916, with the capture of that ground towards the end of the Battle of the Somme and the final assault of Canadian troops in the attack on Desire Trench on the 18th of November 1916 in a snowstorm. And we're looking up to that ground. We can see that ridgeline. That's where Canon Scott went to retrieve his son, Captain Scott, of the Canadian Infantry during the fighting there in October of 1916, and brought him from there all the way back to Albert, to the Bapaume Post Cemetery that we passed earlier. And when you look over this landscape, you can see layer after layer after layer, story after story. There is so much. There are multiple lifetimes of discovery, I think. I think that is one of the elements of this culture. This is not something that us as individuals will ever get to the end of. And that is part of its fascination. It means that we've got a lifetime of discovery ahead of us if that's what we choose. And the battlefields and the landscape will continue to tell us things. We'll get so much from it and so much understanding in the days and the months and the years that we may spend here over our lifetime. And I think that's how it continues to give. That's how I've felt over more than 40 years now of seeing this landscape, walking this landscape, and continuing to understand, evolving my understanding of it as that time has gone along. And I hope that that will always continue. So I think this is a really important part of our journey along this pathway. It's brought us to very much a kind of nodal point, a very definitive and defining part of the Somme battlefields, where we can see so much from just this one place. But we'll continue, and we'll come on the fringes of Courcelette, where the Canadians were. Over 2 months of fighting there for them, 24,000 casualties, 8,500 Canadian soldiers killed in action, of which over 6,000 were missing, and half of the names on the Vimy Memorial, much more famous than Courcelette, but few realise that half those names are men who died in the fields that we can see here. And we come up alongside the Courcelette sugar factory just on the left-hand side. This was part of the German positions here. It was defended. It had a trench close to it, sugar trench. Tanks went forward with the Canadians and captured this position on the 15th September 1916. But it was a well-known landmark. The tower of the chimney of the sugar factory and the buildings of the sugar factory were a well-known landmark to the Germans when this was behind their line. The image that I've used as the image for this podcast episode is a German colour postcard from the spring of 1916 showing some German soldiers on horseback coming down the tree-lined Albert-Bapaume Road with the sugar factory behind them. So an important part of their culture, their understanding, their awareness of this part of the landscape to them from their perspective, coming in the opposite direction to which we've travelled up towards what would have been their forward zone of the battlefield. And just beyond the far side of Courcelette, we come to the Canadian Memorial, one of the big granite blocks with the maple leaf symbol of Canada in a little park commemorating that Canadian sacrifice on the Somme. It's a place that needs more Canadian visitors, really, Courcelette. It's such an important battlefield, a turning point in Canada's history on the Western Front, the first village in Canadian history in France liberated by Canadian troops in the 20th century that would kind of set a pattern for the Canadian experience in places like France for much of the rest of the first half of the 20th century, when we think of Normandy and the liberation in 1944, for example, and also part of Canada's military development on the battlefield, leading to their ability to fight battles on the Western Front later on. Yes, Vimy, of course, but much more importantly, those battles of 1918 when they beat the German army on the Somme in August and then broke through the Hindenburg line, the Drocourt-Quéant switch line, and onwards to Bourlon and Cambrai, and indeed beyond all the way to Mons. So moving away from really Canada's beacon to its sacrifice on the Somme in 1916, the road continues, the pathway that we're on, the Albert-Bapaume Road, continues to tell us more. Over to our right is the village of Martinpuy, where the 15th Scottish Division was when tanks were used for the first time. Tanks came up in support. Some of those tanks filmed by the official cinematographers in the advance on the village here. And as we come in towards the next village on this road, there's a big farm complex on the left-hand side, D'Estremont Farm. It's a very imposing farm building. Beyond it was the last fringes of Regina Trench, and there was heavy fighting in and around that farm in October of 1916. It was on the flank of the Canadian and British forces, so just beyond it were the Canadian-Scottish attacks, for example, on Regina Trench, in which Piper Richardson went forward and piped his troops and was subsequently awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross for piping the men on the battlefield and then going back to retrieve his pipes, never to be seen alive again. His grave can be found in Adanac Cemetery between Courcelette and Miramont. Adanac, Canada, spelt backwards, a kind of nod to the Canadian sacrifice on the Somme in 1916. But the farm, which again many people just passed by, was a real kind of key point of operations in this move forward in this eastern part of the Somme battlefield. The farm guarded the approaches to the village of Les Sars, guarded the flanks of Regina Trench, and until it was overrun and taken, this ground couldn't be captured. And the Sars that we come into now, again, another one of these functional villages on the Somme today, was nevertheless very important because it sat on the final bit of high ground that looked towards the town of Bapaume. When the British Army got here in October 1916, they could see the towers of Bapaume in the distance. That objective, that town that had been part of the objectives at the very beginning of the Battle of the Somme, was so tantalizingly close. They were almost there, but the weather was changing. And when you spend time on this battlefield, this landscape today, and you come here, not just in the summer, but in other seasons as well, you can see how that landscape and that weather on that landscape changes so frequently. You can have a warm, dry day and then absolutely horrendous rain, and the fields just turn into a vast quagmire. It's very illuminating, I think, to come here in bad weather and at all seasons to understand how the weather changes the landscape and would have changed the army's ability to fight and exist and survive in that landscape as well. But in October 1916, when Les Sars, which we're in now, was taken, beyond it were some of the last German trench lines before Bapaume, but also an old burial mound, the Butte de Wallencourt. And as we come downhill out of the village, passing the civil cemetery on our right-hand side, I think of one of the veterans I knew, Norman, who was a Royal Engineer signaller here in October 1916. It's very close to where his signal station was. He was relaying signals from the frontline area just below the Butte de Wallencourt back to the rear link behind him, the signals unit behind him, so he could then relay what was happening in the front line back to those who were further away from the battlefield. One of many men doing this vital kind of signal work here. And again, when I traverse this landscape, I look at different points and I think of those veterans that I interviewed. That road connects me to this veteran, that wood to another, this lane to this veteran. And you can do that even if you've never met a veteran. Once you read the literature of the Great War, the memoirs of the Great War, those are the ways in which you can then layer the experiences that you read in them to the landscape as it is today, and have your own points that you think of Robert Graves or Siegfried Sassoon or Henry Williamson or Bernard Adams or whichever author it is on whichever part of the battlefield that you're visiting. But we soon come to the Butte de Wallencourt. It's an old burial mound, not a Roman burial mound, much earlier than that, I think. And it sat on some rising ground, itself obviously a mound, gave further observation, and the British Army became kind of obsessed with it in October and November of 1916, with not just British troops, but South Africans fought there as well, with attack after attack going in, and the hill changing hands, casualties heavy on both sides. Roland Boys Bradford, who commanded one of the battalions of the Durham Line Infantry, was awarded his Victoria Cross for bravery in leading his men forward in the attack here from the nearby Eaucourt-l'Abbaye farm complex up towards the Butte de Wallencourt. He would go on to become a brigadier general, the youngest brigadier general in the British Army, and died of wounds in the Battle of Cambrai, having fought in Boulogne-Wood in November 1917, aged only 25. He achieved an incredible amount in that young life of his. For many years, when I first came here, the Butte de Wallencourt was overgrown, pretty rough. You had to kind of scramble up the sides. There was a German memorial that had been placed there. The Germans memorialised it as well. They then replaced that monument in the Second World War, and there was a concrete base with a wooden cross at a rather dangerous kind of angle falling into the undergrowth. And then there was threats that the Butte de Wallencourt was going to be levelled by the landowner. And in the 1980s, the Western Front Association moved in and they purchased the Butte and preserved it, opened it up as a memorial site. It's remained in WFA possession for many, many years until it was sold to a private individual, and now it's in the care of the Hawthorne Crater Association. So the lads who've often come onto our supporters meetings and spoken about the work that they've done at the Hawthorne Crater, they are now managing this site, and considering the excellent work that they've done at Hawthorne, then I know right now, as I speak right now, they're doing some major renovation work at the Butte de Wallencourt, and it will be safe to visit, easy to access, and once more part of our understanding of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, because we've now travelled, as we came over the high ground of the Tara-Usna Hill down towards La Boisselle, where the battle began on the 1st of July. In this sector is where the Battle of the Somme came to an end on the 18th of November 1916. Now that date is not kind of a random date, because that is a period in which some of the last major attacks took place, but the battle's nomenclature committee after the war basically divided up the Great War into manageable chunks, which could then be analysed and understood and written about by historians, and that's kind of how these dates often come about. The men on the ground who were here in 1916 wouldn't have said to each other, well, that's it, lads, 18th of November, Battle of the Somme's over. For them, there wouldn't have been an apparent end to it. So these are historical constructs, but they are themselves part of the culture of the old front line, because to understand this vast subject of the First World War, we can't always see it in the round. We have to see it in understandable parcels, and dividing it up into date periods is all part of how we comprehend it in many, many ways. But although this is where the Battle of the Somme comes to an end in 1916, this is not the end of our journey. We're going to continue along the Albert-Bapaume Road. We'll come to Wallencourt British Cemetery, which, coming from this direction, is the last British cemetery we see. But if you travel down from the Channel coast, come off the motorway and drive down the Albert-Bapaume Road towards Albert, this is the first cemetery that you see when you enter this landscape. It's a cemetery that reflects the fighting of October and November of 1916, with men from the British regiments that fought around the Butte de Wallencourt, South Africans. The New Zealanders passed through this area in 1918 en route to Bapaume, and there are many New Zealand casualties buried in here as well. But we're going to continue beyond that in towards the final approaches of Bapaume, the town we can see ahead of us, come up over a final high point where there's now a vast industrial complex that really stands out on this modern landscape, and if nothing else gives us a marker point on the skyline where we can visibly see the final approaches to the town of Bapaume if we're far away at Delville Wood or High Wood or on the high ground at Regina Trench. It's useful from that point of view. But over to our right, as we come up to the final roundabout before we get into Bapaume, there's a long embankment on the right-hand side, beyond which there is a modern wind farm. That embankment, underneath it, is a whole system of tunnels that the Germans utilised in the First World War to move troops from the cellars and from the citadel in Bapaume, because there was a whole series of ramparts around one part of the town where there were tunnels underneath. That was linked up with the tunnels that were here, and underneath that embankment is this system of tunnels which German troops used to go underground from the town up towards the battlefield area and then eventually join the trench system. None of that is open today. I've never been in there, but I've seen the German maps and the German archives pointing to the fact that it's there. And again, as you come across that roundabout, come into the outskirts of Bapaume, you can see that long embankment, and that's another kind of layer to our understanding of how the Germans then use this landscape. But this road will take us into the modern housing and the shops and the supermarkets on the edge of the town of Bapaume, and then we'll come to the end of the Albert-Bapaume Road itself, where it meets the Bapaume-Arras and the Bapaume-Perron Road, and we're going to turn off to the right and make our way down to the town hall. Now, Bapaume is a town that was not captured by British soldiers until the German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line in the spring of 1917, when they just gave it up. And then it was retaken by the Germans in March of 1918, and then retaken by British and New Zealand soldiers in the summer of the same year. So it changed hands on quite a few occasions, completely destroyed, just like Albert, by the end of the war. The city of Sheffield was the city that adopted Bapaume, and there was a twinning between Sheffield and Bapaume in the 1920s. And again, although that twinning doesn't exist, there was connections remade during the centenary, and there is an indication of the twinning both in Sheffield itself, and I went to see this rather large ceramic urn that the people of Bapaume gave to the city of Sheffield, which is in the town hall there when I lived in South Yorkshire, and there's a similar kind of mark of this twinning in the town hall of Bapaume itself. But putting aside the British and Commonwealth connections, it's important when we come to this landscape and we come to towns like Bapaume, which are not so much part of the British, in inverted commas, story, but are much more parts of the German story, that we understand this from the German perspective. As we said at the beginning, Bapaume, an important town in the German perspective of the Battle of the Somme. Their troops rested here because it was so far away from the fight that they were able to billet their troops in the town safely. There were medical facilities. There were a number of German burial grounds in and around Bapaume, where they brought their dead back from the battlefields to be buried here in what they called Heldenfeld, heroes' fields. There was the railhead on the outskirts of the town that was so important. And when the Germans memorialised during the war their service in this sector by writing about it, but also publishing photo books, which was very common in the German experience, they would publish these softback books with combat photographers and divisional photographers' photographs in them. And there was one that was published that used a symbol of Bapaume on the front cover of it and has lots of photographs of Bapaume in it. In fact, all of them. And der Somme is a good example. There's lots of pictures of German troops marching through Bapaume and the town hall, and there's a statue to General Faidherbe, who was a hero of the Franco-Prussian War. That often appears on the photographs too. So we've got to kind of think for a minute, go back to Albert, think of that from the perspective of British and Commonwealth troops going up to the front in 1916, and we've got to kind of turn that on its head now as we understand the culture of this part of the Somme battlefields and look at it from the German perspective, who would have gone here at Bapaume down the road in the opposite direction to what we have travelled towards their forward positions to fight the British and before them the French on this part of the Western Front. So for this walk, we've largely followed the perspective of Britain and its empire soldiers, travelling as we have done along that road from Albert to Bapaume, where we are now, but ending here in the shadow of Bapaume Town Hall, a town that was obviously so important to the German soldier and his experiences on the Somme, we have to reflect on what these pathways meant to all of those soldiers who were here during the Great War. The landscape of this conflict and the pathways which crisscross it continue to challenge us like that, I think. They make us reflect on both the past and the present. They bring us to these nodal points of that landscape, and through what Henry Williamson called ancient sunlight, which he felt rose like a new truth, it forces us to think of this culture we've come to understand on those battlefields, beginning to understand, and are still understanding the culture of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.